Title: The Midnight Watch, Chapter 1. The First Shift. The convenience store sat at the edge of a lonely road, shrouded in shadows cast by thick trees lining the winding path. This was Route 13, a road infamous in the town's history for accidents, disappearances, and whispers of strange sightings. Jack, new to the night shift, had heard the stories but dismissed them as small-town superstition. It was just a road, he told himself, a stretch of asphalt like any other. When he arrived that night, his boss, a grizzled man named Carl, gave him a long look. "You sure you're up for the graveyard shift?" Carl's voice was rough, filled with a warning Jack could feel more than hear. Jack shrugged. "I'm fine. Besides, I don't believe in ghost stories." He gave Carl a lopsided smile, but the older man didn't return it. "Keep it that way," Carl muttered, almost to himself. "Stay in the store. Don't go near the road if you can help it. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the people who come in here late at night." He handed Jack the keys, clapped him on the shoulder, and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him. Jack chuckled to himself as he watched Carl's car vanish down the dark stretch of Route 13. The silence settled thickly around him, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. He turned to take stock of the store, its empty aisles, the rows of chips, candy, and rows of drinks that stretched out in every direction, creating a bizarre kind of comfort. It was just a job, just a quiet night in a town too small to be interesting. He'd catch up on reading, maybe listen to some music. Hours passed without incident. Jack had almost begun to relax, letting the repetitive work lull him into a calm trance. He glanced at the clock, surprised to see that it was nearing 1 a.m. Just then, the bell above the door chimed, making him jump. A man in his 50s walked in, wearing a faded grey coat, his eyes fixed on the floor. Jack greeted him, but the man didn't respond. He drifted down the aisles, moving with a slow, almost mechanical gait. Jack felt an inexplicable tension creep into his chest as he watched the man. The stranger picked up a single item, a dusty packet of gum, something Jack hadn't seen stocked in months. When he came to the counter, he set the gum down and raised his head, looking at Jack with eyes that seemed hollow, empty, like he was looking at Jack, but not truly seeing him. 150, Jack said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. The man didn't move, only stared, his lips twitching as if trying to form words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Do you know the road?" Jack blinked, thrown off guard. Yeah, Route 13. I mean, I know it's supposed to be haunted or something, right?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Not haunted, guarded." His voice was so low that Jack could barely hear it, each word creeping into his mind like a sinister melody. Jack's fingers brushed against the packet of gum. It felt wrong, like it was damp and sticky. He looked down, expecting to see his hand smeared, but there was nothing. He quickly handed it back to the man, who took it with cold, bony fingers and left without another word. As the man disappeared into the shadows, Jack felt an overwhelming urge to follow him, to see where he would go. He stepped outside, squinting into the darkness, but the man was gone. The road stretched out before him, silent, the trees lining it seeming to close in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. A low whisper filled the air, like the wind, carrying fragments of words that he couldn't understand. Shivers ran down his spine. He quickly went back inside, locking the door behind him. Just a creepy customer, he told himself. Nothing more. But the feeling of unease lingered, the store suddenly seeming darker, the shadows heavier. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. Jack found himself glancing at the door every few seconds, half expecting another strange visitor to walk in. The silence became oppressive. Each creak and hum amplified until he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Around 3 a.m. the lights flickered. Jack froze, his eyes darting to the rows of shelves, the dark spaces between them seeming to grow wider, deeper. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker, like someone slipping through the aisles. "Hello?" His voice echoed in the emptiness, sounding small, almost childlike. No answer. The lights steadied and everything was still. Jack let out a shaky breath, laughing at himself for being so jumpy. He was just tired, that was all. But then the bell above the door chimed again, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. A young woman stood in the doorway, drenched from head to toe, her clothes clinging to her skin as if she had been walking through rain. But there hadn't been a drop all night. Her eyes were vacant, her skin pale, and she stared at Jack with an expression that made his stomach twist. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond. She walked to the counter, moving slowly, almost reluctantly, as if something were holding her back. She looked at him, her gaze piercing, and Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hollow, almost mechanical. Jack forced a smile, trying to keep his tone light. "I work here. It's my job." The woman shook her head, a strange sadness in her eyes. "No, not here. Not on the road. It sees you now." Jack felt his mouth go dry. "What? What sees me?" But the woman didn't answer. She took a single step back, her expression blank, before turning and walking out of the store. Jack's mind raced as he watched her disappear down Route 13, her figure swallowed by the shadows until there was no sign she had been there at all. He stood there for a long moment, unable to move, his body frozen in fear. The whispers returned, growing louder, pressing against his mind, filling him with a dread he couldn't shake. The lights flickered again, casting strange, distorted shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls. Just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. Jack tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but the woman's words lingered in his mind. "It sees you now." He spent the rest of his shift on edge, jumping at every sound, every flicker of the lights. When his shift finally ended, he stepped outside, the first rays of dawn just starting to break over the horizon. The road was quiet, empty, the shadows receding in the early morning light. Jack took a deep breath, his heart still racing. He tried to laugh it off, to tell himself it was just a long night, his imagination running wild. But as he walked home, he felt a presence behind him, a dark, cold sensation that sent shivers down his spine. He glanced back, half expecting to see the woman, the strange man, or something even worse, but the road was empty, silent. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him. And deep down he knew his nights on Route 13 were just beginning. Chapter 2. Strange Encounters. As night fell, Jack felt the weight of dread settle over him once more. He'd barely slept since his last shift, the events of the night replaying in his mind. The strange man, the soaked woman, the whispers on Route 13. They haunted him, but he couldn't back out. He needed the job, and he told himself it was just a trick of the night, an overactive imagination. When he arrived, his boss Carl was waiting by the door, leaning against the wall, his eyes shadowed. Carl handed him the keys without a word, but as Jack took them, Carl held on a moment longer. "Whatever you saw, just keep your head down. Do your job, but don't go looking for answers." His voice was a harsh whisper, as if he feared the night itself would hear. Jack nodded, swallowing the unease that rose in his throat. Carl left, and the silence settled thickly around the store. Jack turned on the lights, which flickered to life slowly, casting a pale glow over the rows of empty aisles. The hum of the refrigerators was louder than usual, filling the air with an almost mechanical heartbeat. Jack started his routine, stocking shelves and wiping down counters. The minutes dragged by, each one punctuated by the creaks and groans of the old building. It wasn't long before he became acutely aware of the silence outside, the heavy presence of the road lurking just beyond the doors. The bell chimed, making him jump. A young man entered, wearing clothes that seemed slightly out of date, a dark, old-fashioned coat with buttons that glinted in the fluorescent lights. His expression was blank, his eyes fixed on something distant, as though he didn't truly see Jack or the store. He moved slowly, his steps eerily quiet. Jack forced a smile, his voice strained. "Good evening. Can I help you with anything?" The man ignored him, drifting down the aisles like a ghost, his hand brushing against the shelves. He paused at the drinks section, reaching out to pick up an old glass bottle of cola, the kind the store had stopped selling months ago. Jack's skin prickled. He couldn't remember restocking those bottles. The man made his way to the counter, setting the bottle down. He looked at Jack, his gaze piercing, as if staring straight into his soul. "$2.50, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. He simply tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. Jack's pulse quickened, his hands cold as he took the man's money, the coins feeling heavier than they should. The man picked up the cola and walked toward the door, pausing just as he reached it. He turned back, his voice low, hollow. "Route 13. It doesn't let go." Jack blinked, the man's words sending a chill through him. He opened his mouth to respond, but the man had already turned, disappearing into the shadows outside. Jack watched the door for a long time, half expecting him to come back. But the street was silent, empty. He tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered, crawling under his skin. He glanced at the clock, 2 a.m. The store felt darker, the corners of the room swallowed by shadows that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, feeling as though he were being watched. Another hour crawled by, and Jack felt his exhaustion weigh on him. He tried to distract himself, fiddling with the radio, adjusting the static-filled channels. But each station only seemed to amplify the silence, the crackling sounds adding an eerie layer to the already tense atmosphere. The bell above the door chimed again, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. This time it was his friend Mark, looking skeptical and a little annoyed. "Dude, you look like hell," Mark said, giving Jack a once-over. "Are you actually freaked out by those stupid stories?" Jack forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "You wouldn't believe the stuff that goes on here, Mark. Weird people, weird energy. It's like the whole place is haunted." Mark snorted, shaking his head. "You're spending way too much time alone, man. It's just a store." But as he spoke, the lights flickered, casting quick, sharp shadows across the walls. The sound of static from the radio grew louder, filling the room with a strange, buzzing hum. Mark's smirk faded, his face paling. "What the—" Mark turned, his gaze darting around the store. A figure stood in the back of the store, partially hidden by the shelves. Jack felt his blood turn to ice. The person was barely visible in the flickering light, their outline blurry, their face obscured. He couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, young or old, just a shape, a presence that radiated cold, a darkness that seemed to pulse with each flicker of the lights. "Hey, anyone back there?" Mark called out, his voice wavering. The figure didn't move. It remained still, silent, watching. Jack could feel its gaze, sharp and cold, cutting through the dimness. Let's just stay here," Jack whispered, pulling Mark closer to the counter. His instincts screamed at him to stay put, to not confront whatever it was lurking in the shadows. But Mark, ever skeptical, shook him off. "Come on, it's probably just a homeless guy or something. I'll check it out." Jack grabbed his arm, his voice desperate. "No, Mark, don't. There's something wrong here. I can feel it." Mark gave him a look of annoyance but stopped, seeming to finally notice the genuine fear in Jack's eyes. They stood there in tense silence, watching the dark shape in the back. The figure remained motionless, like it was waiting for something, or someone. Then, slowly, it began to retreat, moving backward until it melted into the shadows and vanished completely. The light steadied, the buzzing static from the radio faded, and the room was silent once more. Mark let out a shaky laugh, though his voice trembled. "Okay. That was weird." Jack didn't respond. He could still feel the presence lingering, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing down on him, filling him with a dread he couldn't shake. He knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning, that whatever was haunting the road had seen him, had marked him. "Let's get out of here," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he spoke, he knew he couldn't leave. The shift wasn't over, and a part of him felt that the store, Route 13 itself, wouldn't let him go until it was done with him. Mark stayed with him for a while longer, their conversation tense and halting. They tried to laugh it off, to pretend it was just a fluke, but the atmosphere in the store was heavy, the shadows longer, darker, seeming to watch them. Just before dawn, Mark left, throwing Jack a look of uneasy reassurance before disappearing into the dim light. Jack watched him go, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew he should warn Mark to stay away from the road, to avoid the store at night, but he couldn't bring himself to speak the words. As the first light of morning broke over the horizon, Jack locked up, his hands trembling, the night's events replaying in his mind. He could feel the darkness clinging to him, wrapping around him, a part of him now. And as he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows had followed him, that Route 13 was watching, waiting for him to return. Chapter 3. The Rumours of Route 13. The following night, as Jack prepared for his shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The presence felt thick and oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing against his skin. The store, Route 13, and even the town itself seemed changed, tainted by whatever dark energy lingered along that cursed road. His mind was clouded with questions, gnawing at his sanity. Each night on the job, he felt himself slipping further from reality. The dark presence, the strange visitors, and the cryptic warnings about the Watcher haunted him. He wondered if he was truly losing his mind, or if something far more sinister was playing with him. The whispers of Route 13 followed him everywhere, and tonight, he was determined to find out what he could. The first story. When Jack arrived at the store, he found Carl, his grizzled boss, waiting with a weary expression. As Jack stepped inside, Carl shot him a grim look, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and perhaps something darker. "You're early tonight," Carl remarked, a slight tremor in his voice. Jack nodded, unsure of how to bring up the strange occurrences. But before he could speak, Carl seemed to read his mind, his face hardening as if bracing for something unpleasant. "Listen, kid," Carl began, his tone unusually serious. "You've seen things, haven't you? On the road, in the store." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Carl, what's going on here? I've seen things I can't explain. Shadows in the fog. People who don't seem real." Carl sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to erase memories that had long haunted him. "It's the road, Jack. Route 13 has a history, a dark one." "What kind of history?" Jack pressed, his pulse quickening. Carl looked away, his face pale. "Decades ago, there was a terrible accident on Route 13. They say a bus carrying schoolchildren veered off the road in the fog and crashed into the ravine nearby. No one survived. After that, the road changed. People started seeing strange things, figures in the fog, voices in the night, and then the disappearances started." Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Disappearances?" Carl nodded, his gaze distant. "People went missing. Travelers, hitchhikers, even locals. The road seemed to take them, like it was hungry." He swallowed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some say the Watcher is the spirit of one of the kids who died, bound to the road, cursed to take lost souls as his own." Jack's mind spun, a mixture of fear and fascination clawing at him. The Watcher, is he real? Carl's eyes were dark, haunted. "All I know is that once you've seen him, he never leaves you alone." Jack shuddered, the weight of Carl's words pressing down on him. The Watcher was no ordinary ghost story. He was something darker, something that clung to you, a shadow you couldn't shake. Seeking answers. That night, Jack was on edge, his nerves raw. The store felt heavier, as though it held memories of its own, secrets etched into the walls. Every creak, every flicker of the lights seemed amplified, filling him with a dread he couldn't escape. As midnight approached, Jack's thoughts drifted to the patrons who had warned him in strange ways. The woman with hollow eyes who said the fog hides him, the man in the out-of-date coat who warned that the road doesn't let go, and the shadowed figure that had watched him from the fog. He spent the night scanning the parking lot, expecting another strange visitor, and right on cue, the bell above the door chimed. Jack's heart pounded as a frail-looking old man shuffled in, his cane tapping against the floor with each step. The man looked around, his eyes milky with age but sharp with purpose. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice barely steady. The old man approached the counter, his gaze never leaving Jack's. "I hear you're asking questions about Route 13, he rasped, his voice like gravel. Jack nodded, trying to keep his composure. "You know about it?" The old man chuckled, a hollow sound. "More than you'd want to know, son. I've lived here my whole life, watched that road claim more souls than I can count." He leaned closer, his breath cold against Jack's skin. "The road doesn't just take you, it keeps you." Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What do you mean?" The old man's gaze darkened. "Those who vanish aren't gone. They're trapped on the road, between this world and the next. Ghosts, but not just spirits. They're bound to the Watcher, their souls twisted and lost." Jack shivered, the words sinking in like poison. He thought of the strange customers, the objects that appeared out of nowhere. Were they remnants of these lost souls, echoes of the lives taken by the road? "Is there any way to stop it?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man shook his head. "No one's ever escaped the Watcher, but I'll tell you this, he's drawn to fear, to those who look too closely. You'd be wise to keep your head down, lad, lest you become part of his collection." With that, the man turned and left, his cane tapping softly as he disappeared into the night. The footsteps from the past. Jack stood there, his mind racing. He thought of the objects he'd found, the old photograph, the pocket watch, the wilted flower. They all seemed to hint at lives lost, remnants of souls claimed by the road. His skin prickled, and he suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable under the watchful gaze of Route 13. As he tried to shake off the unease, he heard footsteps approaching from the back of the store. His heart raced, fear coiling in his stomach as he turned to see a figure standing in the shadows. It was a young woman, her clothes soaked as if she'd walked through rain. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant. Jack felt a surge of dread. It was the same woman who had warned him about the fog on his first night. She looked at him, her expression distant. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "The Watcher. He knows you're here." Jack stepped back, his heart pounding. What does he want? The woman's gaze drifted, her eyes filled with an endless sorrow. He wants what he always does. Souls. He's drawn to those who wander too close to the road, to those who see him. Jack tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The woman's figure flickered, like a mirage, before fading into the shadows. He felt the coldness settle over him, a chill that went bone deep, as if the Watcher's gaze had fallen upon him, marking him. For first me of the midnight bells. As the clock struck midnight, the store fell silent. Jack felt as though he were standing in a dream, caught between waking and nightmare. The lights dimmed, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. He heard the faint sound of bells, soft, distant, like funeral chimes echoing through the fog. Jack felt a pull, an urge to step outside, to see the road bathed in moonlight. But he forced himself to stay, his mind racing with the old man's warning. The road keeps those who look too closely. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the road was calling to him, beckoning him to cross the threshold, to step into its embrace. For the rest of his shift, Jack fought the urge to leave, to walk down Route 13 and face whatever lurked in the fog. His heart pounded with fear, but he knew that his curiosity had awakened something, drawn its gaze. He had seen too much, and now there was no going back. The dawn escape. As dawn approached, Jack locked up, the weight of the night pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't keep this up, that the road was pulling him in, its whispers growing louder, its shadows darker, and yet a part of him felt compelled to return, drawn to the mystery, to the dark secrets hiding in the fog. As he walked away from the store, he glanced back at Route 13, shrouded in mist. He felt a presence there, watching him, waiting. The Watcher's gaze was upon him, an invisible weight that clung to him, filling him with a dread he couldn't escape. And as he walked down the empty road, he knew that the Watcher would always be there, a shadow lurking in the fog, waiting for him to return. Chapter 4. Footsteps in the fog. Jack's shifts had taken on a surreal quality. The store, Route 13, even the town itself felt different now, like a dark cloud had settled over everything, thickening with each night. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were closing in, pressing tighter, watching him with unseen eyes. On this particular night, the air outside was thick with fog. It clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around the trees and creeping along the road in soft, sinister tendrils. Jack's footsteps echoed in the quiet, muted by the fog, and the silence felt alive, buzzing with tension. When he arrived at the store, the parking lot was empty, swallowed by the mist. The fluorescent lights above the door flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow that barely cut through the dense fog. As he fumbled with the keys, he thought he saw a shadow moving at the edge of the lot, a tall, hunched figure that seemed to melt into the mist. He shook his head, chalking it up to his nerves and the fog's play on his senses. But as he stepped inside and locked the door behind him, he felt a prickling on the back of his neck, like cold fingers brushing against his skin. Tonight, the store felt different. The familiar shelves and aisles seemed to twist in the dim light, the rows stretching longer, the shadows deeper. Jack moved behind the counter, forcing himself to focus on his routine, trying to ignore the oppressive silence that wrapped around him. Half an hour into his shift, the bell above the door chimed. Jack's head snapped up, his pulse quickening. He hadn't seen or heard anyone approach, yet a figure now stood in the doorway. A woman, her face pale, her clothes drenched as if she'd been caught in a storm. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with shadows, and her gaze was distant, fixed somewhere beyond him. Jack swallowed, his voice catching in his throat. Can I help you?" The woman didn't respond. She moved into the store, her footsteps soft, almost soundless. She didn't look at him as she drifted down the aisle, her hands brushing against the shelves. There was something dreamlike about her movements, as if she were sleepwalking, caught between this world and another. Jack's skin prickled. He watched her, a sense of dread settling over him, heavy and cold. The woman stopped in front of a shelf, picking up an old, dusty candle that Jack hadn't noticed before. She held it, staring at it with an expression that was both blank and deeply haunted. After a long moment, she turned to him, her gaze piercing. "The fog," she whispered, her voice so faint that he had to strain to hear. "The fog hides him." Jack blinked, confusion mixing with fear. I'm sorry. Who are you talking about?" The woman's eyes widened, a flicker of terror crossing her face. "He watches, he waits. In the fog. He's always there." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the woman turned and hurried out of the store, disappearing into the mist as if she had never been there. The bell chimed behind her, leaving Jack alone in the oppressive silence. He stood there, his mind racing. He'd seen strange customers before, but this woman was different. Her words lingered in his mind, echoing through the quiet store, filling him with a sense of foreboding that was hard to shake. Hours passed, and Jack found himself glancing at the door, half expecting to see the woman return. The fog outside thickened, wrapping around the building like a shroud, pressing against the windows in swirling patterns. He could barely see the parking lot anymore. The world beyond the glass was a blank grey void. Then, he heard it. Footsteps, soft, muffled, coming from somewhere outside the store. They were slow, deliberate, each step echoing through the fog. Jack's heart pounded, his eyes fixed on the door, but he couldn't see anyone. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they sounded as if they were just outside. Jack held his breath, his body tense, waiting. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and thick, and he could feel the weight of eyes on him, unseen but unmistakable. And then, as quickly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker than ever, suffocating. Jack let out a shaky breath, his pulse racing. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him in the fog. But a part of him knew that wasn't true. He moved to the counter, his eyes darting to the darkened corners of the store. The shadows seemed to shift, stretching along the walls, curling around the shelves in shapes that almost looked like figures. The bell above the door chimed again, and Jack's heart leapt. A figure entered, tall and thin, wrapped in a long coat that seemed to blend with the fog. The man's face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes obscured by shadows. He moved slowly, his footsteps heavy, echoing through the quiet store. "Good evening," Jack said, forcing a smile, his voice barely steady. The man didn't respond. He walked to the counter, setting down a pack of cigarettes. As Jack rang him up, the man finally looked at him, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The man's eyes were empty, devoid of any light or warmth. They were dark, hollow, like staring into the void. Jack felt as though those eyes could see right through him, peeling back layers of his soul, exposing every hidden fear. "Route 13, the man said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "It's older than this town. Older than any of us." Jack forced himself to speak, though his throat was tight with fear. "People say strange things happen there." The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "The road has its own rules. It doesn't like those who break them." Jack's hands trembled as he handed the man his change. What kind of rules?" The man didn't answer. He pocketed the change, turning to leave. But just before he stepped outside, he paused, glancing back at Jack. "If you see him in the fog," he murmured, "don't follow, don't speak. And whatever you do, don't look too closely." With that, the man disappeared into the mist, his figure swallowed by the grey nothingness. The bell chimed once more, leaving Jack alone in the silence. Jack's mind raced, the man's words repeating in his head. "If you see him in the fog, don't look too closely." He spent the rest of his shift in a tense silence, jumping at every small sound, every flicker of movement in the corners of his vision. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, thick and impenetrable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from within it. Just before dawn, Jack stepped outside, the fog wrapping around him like cold fingers. He took a shaky breath, glancing down Route 13. The road was empty, stretching into the mist, silent and foreboding. But as he turned to leave, he thought he saw a figure standing far down the road, barely visible through the fog. It was tall, thin, and wrapped in shadows, its face hidden, its eyes watching him. Jack's heart pounded, his body frozen with fear. He remembered the man's warning, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure stood there, silent, unmoving, its gaze piercing through the mist. And then, slowly, it lifted a hand, beckoning him forward. Jack stumbled back, his pulse racing, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned and ran, the fog swallowing his footsteps, the figure's unseen eyes following him as he fled. As he reached the safety of his car, he glanced back one last time, but the figure was gone, vanished into the mist. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, an oppressive weight that clung to him, filling him with a dread he couldn't shake. And as he drove away, the fog parting around him, he knew that the road, and whatever haunted it, had marked him. The whispers, the shadows, the strange visitors, they were all part of something larger, something dark and ancient, and Jack had a terrible feeling that this was only the beginning. Chapter 5: The Lost Items. The fog clung to Jack's thoughts long after he'd left Route 13. Days passed in a blur, haunted by flashes of fog and shadows, as if fragments of his night shifts lingered in his mind, refusing to let go. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale faces of his strange visitors. The woman with the drenched dress, the man with empty eyes, and the dark figure in the fog that had beckoned him. Despite the growing dread in his heart, Jack returned to his shifts, each night more unnerving than the last. He felt trapped, bound by some invisible force that made him unable to quit or leave Route 13 behind. On this particular night, as he unlocked the doors and stepped inside the store, a feeling of unease washed over him. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting twisted shadows across the aisles, and he felt a strange stillness settle over the space, as if the entire store were holding its breath. Jack moved behind the counter, determined to ignore the creeping dread. As he settled in, he noticed something strange on one of the shelves near the front of the store. a small, cracked photograph frame, dusty and faded. The image inside showed a young couple, their faces blurred and slightly discolored, as though the photo had aged many years. Frowning, Jack picked up the frame, brushing off the dust. He didn't remember stocking this item, nor had he ever seen it in the store before. He checked the inventory sheet, but there was no record of it. His heart pounded as he inspected the photo more closely. The young couple looked vaguely familiar, their faces stirring a strange memory within him that he couldn't place. His mind was too clouded to make sense of it, so he set the photo down, chalking it up to another eerie coincidence. But as the night wore on, he began to notice other objects around the store that hadn't been there before. A tarnished silver pocket watch lay on the edge of a shelf near the back, ticking slowly, its hands frozen at midnight. A single wilted flower lay on the counter, its petals dry and faded, as though plucked from a graveyard bouquet. Jack's skin prickled, a chill crawling up his spine as he moved through the aisles, each object filling him with a growing sense of dread. These items weren't just old, they felt wrong, as though they held memories and whispers of their own, remnants of lives that had once passed through the shadows of Route 13. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that someone must have left them here, perhaps as a prank. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, and Jack looked up, his heart sinking. Another customer had entered, though he hadn't heard any footsteps outside. The man who stood before him was tall and gaunt, his clothes frayed and faded as though they'd been left out in the sun for years. His face was thin, his eyes sunken, his gaze cold and empty. He walked with a limp, dragging one foot behind him, his every step echoing through the silent store. He approached the counter, his gaze fixed on Jack. Slowly, he placed an old, leather-bound book on the counter, its cover worn and cracked. Jack swallowed, his hands trembling as he looked down at the book. Its title was faded, the words barely visible, but he could make out a single word etched in gold letters. Watchers. The man's voice was low, barely a whisper. He waits, you know, always watching. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He forced himself to keep his voice steady. Who waits? The man tilted his head, his gaze piercing. The one who walks the fog, the keeper of the road. The words sent a shiver through Jack. He remembered the dark figure that had beckoned him from the mist, the shape he'd seen lurking in the shadows of Route 13. The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. Some things are meant to stay lost. You should leave them that way. Before Jack could respond, the man turned and walked out of the store, disappearing into the fog outside. Jack stood there, his mind racing, his heart pounding as he stared at the empty space where the man had been. He glanced down at the book, his fingers brushing over its cracked cover. Something compelled him to open it, his curiosity overriding his fear. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, strange symbols, and drawings of the road, the mist, and shadowed figures lurking at the edges. One entry caught his eye, written in shaky, scrawled handwriting. The road calls to those who seek the truth, but it takes more than it gives. Beware the watcher. Once you see him, he never leaves you. Jack closed the book, his hands shaking. He could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him, a warning that felt both ancient and immediate. The rest of his shift passed in a haze, his mind preoccupied with the book and the strange items scattered throughout the store. As dawn approached, he gathered the mysterious objects, setting them together on the counter, unsure of what to do with them. The photograph, the watch, the flower, and the book. They felt like remnants of forgotten lives, echoes of those who had walked Route 13 and never returned. When his shift finally ended, Jack locked up, casting one last glance at the darkened store. The fog had cleared, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and cold. As he walked down the road, he felt a presence behind him, the same oppressive weight he had felt in the store. He turned, half expecting to see the watcher standing in the distance, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road, stretching into the grey morning light. Yet he knew deep down that the watcher was still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for him to return. Chapter 6. trapped in the shift. Every night, Jack felt the grip of Route 13 tighten around him, as though the road itself had become a living thing, pulling him deeper into its grasp. He was bound to it now, tethered to its strange dark energy, and each shift brought him closer to the heart of its mystery, a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. Tonight, as he stepped inside the convenience store, a feeling of dread washed over him. It was as if the air had thickened, filled with something old, something waiting. The fluorescent lights above flickered in an erratic rhythm, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls and aisles. Jack's heart pounded, the hair on his arms prickling as he made his way to the counter. The familiar surroundings felt foreign, the once mundane aisles and shelves seeming to pulse with a dark life of their own. Jack could feel the presence of Route 13 lurking just outside, an invisible thread connecting him to its cursed path. He was no longer simply a night shift worker. He had become a part of the road's twisted story, a character in its endless, sinister tale. As midnight approached, the store grew colder, the temperature dropping to an unnatural chill that seeped into Jack's bones. His breath fogged in the air, and he could see the faint outlines of his reflection in the windows, distorted by the flickering lights. Shadows twisted and writhed around him, and he began to feel as though he were not alone in the store. Then, the bell above the door chimed, cutting through the silence. Jack's head snapped up, his pulse quickening. He hadn't heard any footsteps outside, no signs of a car pulling up, yet a figure now stood in the doorway, shrouded in shadow. The person stepped inside, their movements slow and deliberate. They wore a long coat that seemed frayed, its edges dissolving into wisps of darkness. Their face was obscured, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over their features. Jack's heart pounded as the figure approached the counter, their presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. "Can I help you?" Jack's voice was barely steady, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the counter. The figure tilted their head, their hidden gaze fixed on him. A low, raspy voice drifted from beneath the hat, sending a chill down Jack's spine. "You're part of it now, boy. The road has seen you, and it doesn't let go." Jack swallowed, his throat dry. What do you mean?" The figure's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "The road doesn't forget those who walk too close to its secrets. It calls to them, binds them, and you belong to it now." Jack felt a surge of panic, his mind racing. "No, I'm just here for work. I don't want anything to do with Route 13. The figure's smile widened, a shadow of dark amusement in their voice. "Wanting has nothing to do with it. Once the road marks you, there's no escape." Before Jack could respond, the figure turned and walked out of the store, vanishing into the shadows beyond the door. Jack stood there, frozen, his heart pounding as the implications of the figure's words sank in. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of fear and unease, every creak and whisper magnified by the silence that surrounded him. He felt trapped, bound to the store, to the road, and he knew, deep down, that he could never truly leave. As dawn approached, Jack locked up, his steps heavy as he walked away from the store. The fog on Route 13 swirled around him, and he could feel the presence of unseen eyes watching, waiting. The road had marked him, and there would be no escape. For Jack, Route 13 was no longer just a job. It was a prison, a curse, and he was its newest captive. Chapter 7. Reflections of the Abyss. Jack knew he should quit his job at the store, leave the cursed road behind and never look back. Yet, he felt bound to it by an invisible force, a pull he couldn't resist. Route 13 was like a dark magnet, drawing him deeper into its twisted web of shadows. Even when he wasn't at the store, his mind drifted to it, the whispers, the strange visitors, the hollow-eyed figures lurking in the mist. The road was under his skin now, as if it had found a home inside him. On this particular night, a thick fog blanketed the town. As he arrived at the store, he felt the chill in the air seeping into his bones, colder and darker than before. It was as if the fog itself had life, an intent to swallow everything it touched. The flickering lights of the store cast strange, shifting shadows across the aisles, and Jack felt that he was stepping into a dream or a nightmare. As he approached the counter, His eyes were drawn to the glass doors, where a distorted reflection of himself stared back at him. His own face looked wrong, darker, more haunted. The reflection seemed to move independently, its eyes hollow and empty, and Jack felt an overwhelming urge to turn away. Shaking off the unsettling image, he set his things down and tried to focus on his work. But the store felt different tonight. The silence was thicker, the air charged with an almost tangible darkness. Every sound echoed unnaturally, filling him with a sense of dread that gnawed at his nerves. Strange shadows. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. As he stocked shelves and counted inventory, Jack began to notice strange objects scattered around the store once again. A small, cracked hand mirror lay in one of the aisles, its reflective surface marred with streaks of black, like it had absorbed the darkness around it. Nearby, an old-fashioned comb with strands of silver hair tangled in its teeth lay discarded on the floor, and on a nearby shelf sat a single, faded glove, its fabric worn and frayed, as though it had been abandoned there for years. These items seemed to carry a weight of their own, relics of forgotten lives that the road had claimed. Jack's pulse quickened, his heart pounding as he moved through the store, each object filling him with a deep, bone-chilling dread. It was as if these items were waiting for him, left there as warnings, or perhaps as offerings to something unseen. Then, the bell above the door chimed, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. He turned to see a figure entering the store, tall and thin, wrapped in a dark coat that seemed to blend with the shadows. The figure's face was obscured, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows over their features. Jack's heart pounded, his body frozen in place as the figure approached the counter. When they finally stopped, they looked up, and Jack felt a jolt of terror shoot through him. The figure's face was his own. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, a twisted version of himself staring back at him with hollow, empty eyes. The reflection, if it was even that, smiled, its lips curling into a grotesque grin. "Hello, Jack," it said, its voice low, echoing with a hollow resonance. "You've come far, haven't you?" Jack stumbled back, his mind reeling. "Who? What are you?" The doppelganger tilted its head, its expression twisted with amusement. "I am you, and you are me. We are bound by the road by its secrets. You cannot escape, Jack. You're a part of it now." Jack's pulse raced, his skin cold with fear. "I don't want any part of this. I just want my life back." The doppelganger's grin widened, its eyes dark and endless. "There is no going back. The road has marked you, claimed you. You belong to it, as I do." Jack's hands shook, his mind racing with panic. "No, this can't be real." The doppelganger stepped closer, its gaze piercing. "Oh, it's real, Jack. More real than anything you've ever known. And soon, you'll understand." With that, the figure dissolved, melting into the shadows, leaving Jack alone in the silence. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, his mind reeling from the encounter. He didn't know what to believe anymore, what was real, and what was part of the road's twisted nightmare. The Watcher returns. As the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The store seemed darker, the shadows deeper, pressing in around him. He felt as though he were being pulled into a void, a dark abyss where reality and nightmare blurred together. Then, as he rounded a corner in one of the aisles, he saw it. A figure stood at the end of the aisle, tall and thin, shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but Jack could feel its gaze piercing through him, a cold, empty stare that filled him with dread. It was the Watcher, the entity he had glimpsed in the fog on Route 13. Jack froze, his body paralyzed with fear as the Watcher stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as the entity approached him, its presence filling the store with an oppressive weight. Jack wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. He was trapped, bound by the Watcher's gaze, a prisoner in its dark domain. The Watcher stopped a few feet away, its face hidden in shadows. Then, in a voice that was little more than a whisper, it spoke. "Why do you fight, Jack? it asked, its voice echoing in his mind. Why resist what is already yours? Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. I don't belong to you, he said, his voice trembling. I just want to leave, to be free of this nightmare. The Watcher tilted its head, as if considering his words. There is no freedom from the road. It has seen you, marked you. You belong to it now as I do. Jack shook his head, his heart pounding. I don't believe that. I refuse to believe that. The Watcher's gaze darkened, its presence growing colder. You will understand soon enough. The road takes what it wants, and it wants you. With that, the Watcher raised a hand, and Jack felt an invisible force pulling him forward, dragging him toward the entity. The shadows closed in around him, wrapping around his body like chains, binding him to the darkness. Jack struggled, his mind screaming in terror, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, their grip too tight. He could feel them seeping into him, filling him with a cold, empty darkness that threatened to consume him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness released him. Jack fell to his knees, gasping for breath, the cold air burning his lungs. When he looked up, the Watcher was gone, and the store was silent once more. The road's prisoner. Jack sat there for a long time, his mind reeling from the encounter. He felt as though he had been to the edge of something dark and unfathomable, a place where reality and nightmare collided. He knew now that there was no escaping Route 13, no breaking free from the road's grip. It had marked him, claimed him, and he was bound to it forever. As he stood up, his reflection caught his eye once again. This time he saw not just himself, but the Watcher, standing just behind him, its hollow gaze watching him from within the glass. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine as he turned away, his pulse racing. He could feel the Watcher's gaze following him, its presence lingering in the shadows, waiting. And as he stepped outside, the fog swirling around him, he knew that he was no longer just a worker on the graveyard shift. He was a prisoner of Route 13, bound to its dark secrets, forever trapped in its twisted web. Chapter 8. The Lurking Darkness. Jack could no longer tell where the store ended and the darkness began. The fog that had surrounded Route 13 was now inside him, as if the road itself had woven a shroud around his mind. He drifted through his shifts in a trance, feeling the weight of something dark and ancient pressing down on him, consuming him from within. And every night, the shadows seemed to deepen, the silence thickening with whispers just at the edge of hearing. Tonight, he could feel it more than ever. The store was empty, silent, the hum of the fluorescent lights muted, as though the air itself had absorbed the sound. Jack's own reflection in the glass doors looked back at him, distorted and dark, a twisted version of himself, hollow-eyed and ghostly. He tore his gaze away and began his routine. As he moved through the aisles, he noticed that the strange items were back. The cracked photograph, the tarnished pocket watch, the wilted flower, each one carrying an eerie weight, as if they were fragments of lives stolen by the road. Jack felt a chill as he looked at them, memories that were not his own flickering through his mind. He turned, feeling the weight of eyes on him, but there was no one there, and yet he could feel the presence of something, or someone, lurking just beyond his vision. The fog grows thicker. Around midnight, the fog outside began to seep in through the cracks in the door, curling around his ankles like ghostly tendrils. Jack could feel it, cold and damp, pressing against his skin, filling him with an icy dread that went bone deep. He tried to focus on his work, but the fog was relentless, wrapping around him, filling the store with a thick, unnatural chill. Then, the bell above the door chimed, though Jack hadn't seen anyone approach. He turned, his heart pounding, to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was the young woman again, the one who had warned him about the fog. Her clothes were still drenched, her skin pale and cold, her eyes vacant. She looked at him, her gaze piercing, as if she were looking right through him. "You're still here," she said, her voice hollow, almost sad. Jack swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't have a choice," he replied. "It won't let me leave." The woman nodded, as though she understood. "The road has taken you, just like it took me. Once you see the Watcher, there's no escape." Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. Who is he? Why does he take people? The woman's gaze drifted, her eyes dark and haunted. The Watcher is the road's keeper, bound to it, cursed to take the souls of those who wander too close. He was once like you, trapped by the road. Now, he is its servant, its guardian, and those who see him are marked. She took a step closer, her voice a whisper. You can feel it, can't you? The darkness inside you, growing stronger, binding you to the road. Soon, you'll be like him. Jack shook his head, his heart pounding. No, I won't let that happen. The woman looked at him, a faint, sad smile playing on her lips. You don't have a choice. The road has already claimed you. With that, she turned and walked out, disappearing into the fog. Jack stood there, his mind racing, her words echoing in his mind. The darkness inside him, growing stronger, the idea filled him with a dread he couldn't shake, as though a part of him knew it was true. Into the abyss hours passed, the silence in the store deepening, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Jack felt as though he were drifting through a void, caught between reality and nightmare. The shadows seemed to writhe around him, twisting into strange shapes, figures that watched him from the corners of his vision. He heard footsteps echoing through the aisles, soft, almost soundless, like someone moving just out of sight. But every time he turned, there was no one there. The fog grew thicker, filling the store with a dense, suffocating darkness. Then, the lights flickered, casting quick, jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Jack's heart pounded, his pulse racing as he felt the darkness pressing in, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and thin, its face hidden in darkness. Jack felt a surge of terror as he recognized the Watcher, his hollow gaze piercing through the fog, watching him with a cold, empty stare. Jack backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. Stay away from me, he whispered, his voice trembling. The Watcher tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Why do you resist, Jack? He asked, his voice low, resonant, filled with a strange sadness. You are part of the road now. It has seen you, marked you. Jack shook his head, his heart pounding. I don't want this. I just want my life back. The Watcher's gaze darkened, his expression almost sympathetic. Once I wanted the same thing, but the road is relentless. It takes what it wants, and it never lets go. Jack felt a surge of despair, his mind racing. There has to be a way to break free. The Watcher looked at him, his eyes hollow, empty. There is no freedom from the road. Only those who embrace it can survive. With that, the Watcher dissolved into the shadows, leaving Jack alone in the thick, suffocating darkness. He stood there, his mind reeling, the weight of the Watcher's words pressing down on him. The road was a prison, a curse, and he was its newest captive. But something inside him refused to give up. He could feel the darkness growing, filling him, but he knew that he had to find a way to fight it, to resist the pull of the road. He had to escape, to break free before the darkness consumed him completely. As he stepped out of the store, the fog closed in around him, wrapping around him like a shroud. He could feel the presence of the road, the weight of unseen eyes watching him, waiting. The road had marked him, claimed him, and he knew that it would never let him go. But he was determined to find a way out, to break the curse of Route 13, no matter the cost. Chapter 9. The Grasp of Shadows. Jack's world had narrowed to a single relentless focus: escape. Each night on Route 13, he felt himself slipping further away from reality, as though the road itself was consuming him. The strange objects, the ghostly visitors, and the whispers were now constants in his life, shadows woven into the fabric of his existence. And the Watcher's warning still echoed in his mind. Once you see him, you're his. Tonight, the fog was denser than ever, curling around the store, pressing against the windows like ghostly hands. Jack felt as though he were standing at the edge of something vast and dark, a chasm waiting to swallow him whole. His shift started like any other, but he was hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of the lights, every whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. He had reached a breaking point, Either he would find a way out, or he would be claimed by Route 13. Descent into madness. Jack moved through the aisles, feeling the oppressive silence bearing down on him. His own reflection in the store's glass doors looked back at him, hollow-eyed and ghostly, like a stranger watching him from the other side. He felt a chill as he realized how much he'd changed. The darkness of Route 13 was becoming part of him, and he knew that if he stayed any longer, he would be lost forever. Then, the bell above the door chimed, and Jack froze. A figure entered the store, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed to blend with the shadows. Jack's heart pounded as the figure approached the counter, its face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. The air grew colder, and Jack could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze on him, heavy and suffocating. The stranger reached into his coat and placed an old, worn map of Route 13 on the counter, its edges frayed, its surface marked with strange symbols and scribbles. "This road," the man's voice was low, almost a whisper. "It has taken many before you. Do you truly think you can escape?" Jack swallowed, his hands trembling as he reached for the map. "I have to try," he said, his voice barely steady. The man's gaze was cold, unreadable. "There is no escape. You are part of the road now, bound to it." Jack felt a surge of defiance. There has to be a way. There must be something, anything, that can break the curse. The man's lips twisted into a faint, unsettling smile. "Perhaps. But the cost may be greater than you are willing to pay." Before Jack could respond, the stranger turned and left, vanishing into the fog as though he had never been there. Jack looked down at the map, his mind racing. The map felt ancient, filled with cryptic symbols and markings that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. There were landmarks he didn't recognize, strange markings he couldn't understand. But one thing was clear. The map was a guide, a key to Route 13's dark secrets. The journey begins with a mixture of fear and determination. Jack decided to follow the map's path. He locked up the store and stepped outside, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud. He knew the risks, knew that he was walking deeper into the darkness, but he couldn't stay trapped in the store forever. As he walked down Route 13, the road stretched out before him, silent and empty. Shadows twisted along the edges of his vision, dark shapes that moved just out of sight, watching him with hollow eyes. Following the map's markings, he found himself in places he'd never seen before. Abandoned structures hidden along the roadside, old stone monuments that seemed to hum with a strange energy, remnants of lives long forgotten. Each landmark seemed to pulse with a dark life of its own, filling him with a creeping dread that clung to him, a reminder that he was treading on cursed ground. He felt as though he were being watched, his every step monitored by unseen eyes lurking in the fog. The heart of the road hours passed, and Jack felt as though he had wandered into another world, a realm where reality and nightmare blurred together. The fog grew thicker, pressing down on him, filling his lungs with a cold, damp chill. His surroundings felt distorted, twisted, like the road itself was shifting, warping around him, trapping him in its grasp. Finally, he reached the place marked at the center of the map, a clearing surrounded by dark trees, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out toward him. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, weathered and cracked, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to glow in the dim light. Jack felt a surge of dread as he approached the altar, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he was too far gone, too entwined with Route 13 to stop now. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold stone, and felt a jolt of energy surge through him, filling him with a darkness that went bone deep. The shadows around him began to shift, coalescing into shapes, figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces, their expressions filled with sorrow and despair. They were the souls trapped by the road, bound to it, cursed to wander its fog-shrouded paths for eternity. Jack felt their pain, their fear, their anger, and he knew that he was on the brink of becoming one of them. A voice echoed through the clearing, deep and resonant, filling him with a dread he had never known. "Why have you come here, Jack?" He turned, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the Watcher. His face was obscured, his form shrouded in darkness, but Jack could feel the weight of his gaze, a cold, empty stare that pierced through him. Jack took a step back, his heart pounding. I want to break the curse. I want to be free. The Watcher tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Freedom comes at a cost. The road does not release its prisoners so easily. Jack felt a surge of defiance. I'll do whatever it takes. The Watcher's gaze darkened, his voice a whisper filled with malice. Very well. But remember, once the road has seen you, it will always find you. The Pact. The Watcher extended a hand, and Jack felt an invisible force pulling him forward, drawing him toward the altar. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, filling him, becoming a part of him. The road's energy coursed through his veins, binding him to it, claiming him as its own. The Watcher's voice echoed in his mind, a whisper filled with ancient power. To break the curse, you must give up what you hold most dear. The road will release you, but it will take something in return. Jack's mind raced, images flashing before his eyes. His memories, his life, his identity. He knew that the road would strip him of everything, leaving him hollow, a shell of who he once was. But he couldn't go back. He had come too far, walked too deeply into the shadows to turn back now. I accept, he whispered, his voice filled with a dark resolve. The Watcher smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and placed a hand on Jack's forehead. The world around him dissolved into darkness, and he felt a surge of pain as the road claimed its price, tearing away pieces of him, stripping him of everything he had once known. He felt his memories fading, his sense of self dissolving, until there was nothing left but the road, an endless stretch of darkness that went on forever. Awakening. When Jack opened his eyes, he was standing on Route 13, alone, the fog swirling around him. The memories of his old life were gone, replaced by fragments of shadows and whispers, remnants of the road's dark secrets. He felt empty, hollow, like a part of him had been erased, replaced by the darkness that now pulsed within him. The road had released him, but it had taken its price, leaving him a shell of who he once was. He looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of the darkness within him, the cold emptiness that had replaced his soul. He knew deep down that he would never truly be free, that the road would always be a part of him, a shadow lurking in his mind, waiting for the day when he would return to its cursed path. And as he walked away, he could feel the eyes of the Watcher upon him, watching, waiting, knowing that he would one day return to the road, bound to it for eternity. Chapter 10. The Final Walk. Jack felt the weight of Route 13 like a shadow pressed into his skin, a part of him as vital as blood and breath. Each night he was away from the road, the pull grew stronger, filling his mind with dark whispers and distant memories that were not his own. He knew he had to return one last time, to the road that had haunted his waking hours and claimed his dreams. This time, he felt it would not let him go. The night was silent when Jack stepped outside. The fog was already there, thick and cold, curling around him like a lover's embrace, yet laced with a chill that seeped into his bones. His footsteps were muffled, swallowed by the dense mist as he walked. The road seemed to stretch before him, a path that led straight into the unknown, into the abyss. The wind carried faint whispers, voices calling his name, familiar yet twisted, echoing through the empty stretch of darkness. He could feel their eyes on him, unseen but palpable, watching, waiting. Crossing over. As Jack walked, he saw a figure emerge from the fog ahead, shrouded in shadows. He felt a surge of dread, but forced himself to continue. The figure came closer, and Jack recognized the tall, thin shape of the Watcher, the keeper of Route 13. His face was still obscured in darkness, his hollow gaze penetrating, as if it could see through every hidden corner of Jack's mind. "You've come back," the Watcher said, his voice a hollow echo. "I didn't have a choice," Jack replied, his voice barely a whisper. "The road. It won't let me go." The Watcher tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "The road sees what it wants, and it has marked you. You have felt its darkness. You are bound to it as I am." Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. "Is there no escape?" The Watcher's silence was answer enough. The fog thickened, and the shadows around them shifted, twisting into shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. Jack felt their presence, souls trapped in a restless limbo bound to the road. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was walking in their footsteps, that he was part of a pattern older than he could comprehend. The price. Everything has a price, the Watcher murmured, as if reading Jack's thoughts. To leave, you must give up what you hold most dear. The road requires a sacrifice. Jack's mind raced, his heart pounding. He didn't know what the Watcher meant, but he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. What must I give? He asked, his voice shaking. The Watcher stepped forward, his hollow gaze fixed on Jack. To break free from the road, you must surrender your memories, your past. You will walk away, but you will be empty. A shadow, a vessel with no recollection of who you were. Jack felt a wave of fear and despair. Memories of his life, his family, his friends, all of it would be erased, leaving him a stranger to himself. But if he refused, he would be bound to Route 13 forever, a prisoner in the fog, just like the lost souls around him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his choice. I accept, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The Watcher nodded, his expression devoid of mercy or warmth. Then let us begin. The ritual. The Watcher raised a hand, and Jack felt a dark energy envelop him, pressing against his mind, his heart. He felt his memories slipping away, one by one, as if pulled from him by unseen hands. His first day at school, his childhood home, the faces of loved ones. All of it faded, dissolving into the fog. He tried to hold on to them, to cling to the fragments of who he was, but the pull was too strong, relentless. He felt a numbness settle over him, a hollow emptiness where his memories had been. His mind was a blank slate, filled only with the endless stretch of Route 13, the road's dark whispers becoming his only reality. When the ritual ended, Jack felt like a stranger in his own skin. He looked at the Watcher, who observed him with a cold, impassive gaze. Who am I? Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if he didn't recognize it as his own. The Watcher's lips curled into a faint smile. You are part of the road now, a shadow walking its path. The final walk. The fog parted, revealing the road stretching into the darkness. Jack felt compelled to follow it, his footsteps guided by an unseen force. He walked in silence, the world around him fading, dissolving into the mist. He was alone, a nameless figure bound to Route 13, a shadow among shadows. As he walked, he saw others, figures shrouded in fog, their faces vacant, their eyes hollow. They were like him, souls who had paid the road's price, reduced to echoes of their former selves. They moved in silence, their steps guided by a compulsion they could not understand, bound to the road forever. Jack felt a sense of kinship with them, an understanding that he was one of them now. He would walk Route 13 for eternity, his memories lost, his past erased, a ghost in the fog. The road stretched on, endless and eternal, a prison without walls. Jack's footsteps echoed in the silence, merging with the whispers of the lost souls around him. He knew, deep down, that he would never escape.